Matthew, thank you very much indeed for accepting my invitation to join me for this podcast. Now, we've known each other for quite a long time, but I have to admit the thing that really made me think, I've got to get Matthew on, is your recent appearance at Disrupt HR, which was brilliant. There were a number of really good speakers, but I have to say, the person who seems to have really captured the audience's attention, because whenever I speak with anyone, did you enjoy Disrupt HR? They all say, Matthew was amazing. It was
Oh,
brilliant fun. So I think it was a great opportunity to perhaps reflect on that a little bit because Disrupt HR is just 5 minutes, and I will include a link to it because it's definitely worth watching. But I'd like to explore a little bit more about the thinking, the feeling that went into that because it was a very passionate and well presented piece. But also explore your background. I mean, now, my knowledge of your background is that you were in the armed forces for a while and then in financial services and then later in regulation.
yeah.
And there's a bit of a theme there in terms of sort of obeying orders or having a sense of duty or control. And I'd also like to explore that. But
Yeah.
let's start with the most recent thing first. Okay.
Okay.
Tell me about Disrupt HR.
Okay. Well, I volunteered for it because uh, there were speakers being sought. I was told that it was going to be TEDx-like, so they were looking for speakers that may not kind of follow the normal path of PowerPoints and death bow PowerPoints.
Mm.
But I'd never been to a Disrupt HR, so I really did think long and hard of taking my normal self,
Mm.
which is in my training, which is still not death by PowerPoint. And I thought I would just amplify myself for 5 minutes and my 20 slides. So really, that's where I went. Now, I must admit, when I finished, I think I may have over egged the pudding. But on your feedback, I feel a little bit better about myself. So thank you.
But I mean, we will encourage people to watch the video, which is now out and available online, and I will include a link. But
Thank
there's
you.
a very powerful message in that, and I don't want to take away from seeing it because it's definitely worth a watch. But I mean, you're a man who has a compliance background, and I'd love you to expand upon that. But this was really an impassioned plea almost to just stop ticking the box and from my point of view, kind of think a little bit more rather than just go through the motions.
Yeah.
You know, you've got a tremendous amount of experience in this area. Tell me about those frustrations and your experience.
Yeah. Yeah. I think age comes into it. So yes, I've been in compliance since I was 16. As you say, I was in the army, I joined the army. My joke is, at least when I was in the army, if I had a problem, I could shoot it, which kind of probably doesn't kind of work as a compliance consultant. But in time and in the development of compliance is we're getting, I think we're getting worse at being compliant. I always, when I joined the Financial Services Commission, so that was I was an early member of that organisation, and I was on the very first on-site inspection that we ever did. Um, Before we were let loose on the industry, we were seconded to IMRO,
Mm.
which was very early adopter of the FCA that we have now. And I remember being in a meeting where the IMRO chap was asking this banker for his, I think it was his complaints file. And the banker kept saying, well, I don't have any complaints, so I don't have a file.
Mm.
And the assessor was constantly asking the question. He wasn't going to budge from this, ticking this box that he had in front of him until the colleague of the banker realised that if he went and got an A4 folder, wrote complaints on it, and then presented an empty file, that the regulator would move on. And that's a true story. And I experienced it, and that was my training to be a regulator. I'd like to think that I didn't follow that path of ridiculousness, but I feel that we've got to a situation now where, as long as you've got a file with the appropriate words on, you're going to pass a test.
Mm.
but the trouble is that's not protecting the business, it's
Hmm.
not protecting the island, and it's not protecting the integrity of anything. And that disturbs me. And I think we can do better. And I think we can do better by engaging everybody in the topic of compliance, whether or not we're talking financial services, data protection, health and safety, whatever it is. I think the very idea of just having a check sheet and telling somebody I've cleaned the toilets, although I'll clean them a week in the future, is not going to help anybody. Again, that's an anecdote from the video, everyone.
And I'd like to expand on that a little, sharing some of my own thoughts and get your reaction to them. And I don't necessarily expect you to agree.
Yeah.
I think one of the great things about podcasting is there's plenty of room for disagreement, different perspectives, and indeed that's substantially why I invite guests on, because they have different views. So I value
Yeah.
that. But I think for me, because increasingly so much stuff now is automated
Yeah.
through technology, and of course increasingly now through AI as well, we're getting to a point where we don't really have to think too much. And when we don't think, we kind of suspend judgment and we rely on systems or certificates to do our checking.
Yeah.
And for me, sort of tick box mentality, I worry about that we're losing our ability to critically think.
Yeah.
And the pursuit is, what does it take to put a tick in the box, rather than what are we actually trying to achieve here?
Yeah.
And I wonder how much these systems, which are designed to help us, are genuinely helpful.
Yeah. I, I think, well, I think you're right to have those thoughts and then to stop and pause. As you're speaking, I think it is worth saying, and I open my presentation with, I'm not an anarchist, and I'm not suggesting that we shouldn't have policies, procedures, systems, controls, and tick sheets. And as you're speaking, I was reminded of a consultant at Comsure who's no longer with us, but is a jolly nice chap, Simon. He was a pilot, and we flew to Guernsey for one of our bits of work, and he flew us in his private aircraft. And he had a check sheet to take off. And it was a brilliant check sheet because it reminded him to turn all the right things on. And when he was landing, he got the other check sheet out, which reminded him to put the wheels down. So I was pleased that we had check sheets, but the check sheet was effective. And it had been designed to be effective. And I think that comes back to possibly the point that you're making here, is a lot of what we're doing now is by rote. We're not doing things where we're actually doing it with intelligence. We're not doing it because we're doing it for ourselves, and we're doing it actually for somebody else. So one of my frustrations, and this is my Gerald Ratner moment, is regulatory consultants, a lot of them, not all of them, will produce documents that have no reflection on the business. They're documents that are a reflection on signposting messages to this regulator. And as long as the regulator see the right signpost, they'll tick the box and move on. The fact that scratching the surface of that organisation suggests that actually things are being done in a way that nobody would be happy with is the reality. And that's my frustration. I try not to do that. I try and encourage my clients to think another way. I'm not suggesting that I don't write them documents, but I refuse to write procedures. Why? Because procedures are how people behave. I'm happy to help with policy, because policy, I can say, well, I can give you a policy for what a law says, because we can interpret that. And I think this is the word policy and procedure get muddled. So a policy is not a procedure. A procedure is what Robin does when they're doing their bookkeeping. They're the steps that they go through to achieve an outcome. And that's where a good check sheet comes. So I think that, that's where kind of the core of my frustration sometimes lie.
But I think you make a really good point there. And the analogy of flying is a really good one, because, of course, the checklist is there, but he is a qualified pilot. The checklist is not there because he's never flown a plane before. The checklist is there because he's competent, capable, trained, and certified, and it's a reminder rather than a lesson.
Yeah. No, again, that's absolutely right. So one of the questions I would always ask somebody in a meeting or in my training, who should take ownership of procedures? And you still get 50-60% of the audience will go, compliance. Well, I'm sorry, I would never give a procedure on bookkeeping, accounting, and numerous other things to me, because I know nothing about any of those things. So why should I write that document? I want the expert, I want the pilot to write the procedure. Now, if he passes me that document and he knows that I've studied air traffic control laws, Jersey, in a bit more detail than he has, he can rest assured that I'll make sure that he has a box that says that he has to give a certain message when he's taking off, because he doesn't know that because he didn't keep himself abreast. So it's the first among equals with this. We're all in it together. We're a machine, a teeth and a cog of the wheel of the machine, and these things do not belong to one person. Your point is the great one, because I want the expert to write the procedures, the doing, the actions. The policy will help the procedure, but the procedure has to be written by the person that knows their job.
And you're somebody who clearly both deeply cares and knows his job. How do you get started in this? What is the talent or burning desire that made you think this is really what I want to do?
Oh dear, that's a question, Tim. I still claim that I'm still waiting to work out what I want to do with my life, but maybe at 59 years old, I need to move on from that. I generally do enjoy what I do. I'm frustrated in what I do. I wish we were more collaborative within the industry, and I think collaborative both on Ireland and elsewhere. I think there's too much noise. There's too many experts. LinkedIn frustrates the heck out of me. There's too many people chattering misguided messages in regard to, compliance is a very narrow word. We're all compliant, hopefully. Hopefully we're all running businesses that are legal. So, good business is compliant business. So the basis of the question, I just enjoy my job. I kind of fell into it. I was in financial services like most Jersey boys. I got the opportunity of joining an organisation that has good intention, which is the Commission. And the Commission wasn't in existence when I joined it. It was still a civil service body in the states of Jersey. There was 7 of us, and we, the purpose of the regulator at that time was to be equivalent to the UK and do on-site visits to a particular type of financial service, and that was equivalent funds, and really that was the genesis of where we are today. A lot of what happens today is not a lot different from that very first visit, but there is a lot different from that very first visit as well.
I'm interested in exploring your point about, and I think it's complex and messy, but this balance between cooperation and competition, how much we collaborate, both as an industry, as an island, as a jurisdiction, and how much we recognize that there's competition for customers, for service, for profit. It's a really complex topic, and none also in the compliance sphere, where I think the cost of compliance has, to a large extent, forced some of the mergers and acquisitions just to find economies of scale. I mean, what are your thoughts on that area?
Well, you're absolutely right, and I think it has been recognised in many circles, including our regulator, that actually that is causing a risk because of this. A lot of our consolidated businesses are run by private equity. I think we all can recognise that private equity, although maybe giving a capitalist sort of good value in regards to return to shareholders also presents a risk because of the pressures that they put on the businesses that they're merging, because they're looking for double-digit returns before they flip out 5 years later, because that's their business model. And when you're dealing with something like financial services, where the only time you can get those economies of scale and increasing growth, generally something has to give.
Mm-hmm.
I think what we saw, there was something in the newspaper last week where I think Lloyd's in the UK have now cut
Yes.
quite a large proportion of their risk department because they weren't business enablers, they were business blockers. Now, that in itself creates a huge debate, and I hope the regulator is having a debate with them about that particular matter, because I think some compliance is blocking business, and it shouldn't be blocking business. Compliance should be an enabler, should be turning yeses to nos, but in a robust manner.
I think that's a really well-made point, and I certainly saw the argument that said exactly which business did this department block. I'm really curious what you're going to do if you have no blockers, which is really quite interesting. And I myself worked in banking for a period of time, and we did one of these personality profile things where you're a bit red or you're a bit blue or you're a bit green or a bit yellow, depending on your personality. And without going into detail, red was effectively pretty driven, dynamic, salesy, and blues tend to be quite cautious, compliant, and checklists. And we were in this room, there were probably maybe 30 of us. And the facilitator said, for a bank, I'm surprised that of the 30 of you here, only 2 are blue. All the rest are monster raving red. And then we had the financial crisis of 2008, and somehow it seemed almost inevitable.
Yeah, but it is interesting, isn't it? And again, I think you know more about this than me, because it's about human factors. I think I'm risk averse, albeit when my IFA asked me to fill out my risk profile, I ensured that I get a good score so I can invest in India and elsewhere, because that's what I want to do, and I don't want him to get into trouble. So, some of these check sheets aren't fit for purpose because they're check sheets. Mm-hmm. Going back to the premise of my conversation, but risk is healthy, risk is good. So one of my good friends is a base jumper. Mm-hmm. He jumps off very small mountains with a parachute. I would, if I'm in his situation, I would either take the stairs if there was, or a cable car. I'm not jumping off. Now he's still alive. I'm going for lunch with him tomorrow, but he manages his risk accordingly. He's a very cautious risk taker. So he's red as hell, but he's going through a process to ensure that he doesn't die. Mm-hmm. So we can go for lunch tomorrow. So there's nothing wrong with being red. Mm-hmm. It's ensuring that by being red, you're doing the right things. And the risk-based approach, which the regulator loves to throw into every conversation, but understanding what that really means, I think, is important. Again, one of the frustrations is we're forced to have an Excel spreadsheet that looks like a rainbow or some sort of political statement that I don't actually think is adding any value to anybody. And there's many a commentator that talks about this, that just says, this is tick boxing for the sake of it. So again, I'm not a risk expert. I haven't been to university and haven't studied something that would take some 5 or 6 years to understand. But having an Excel spreadsheet, I just don't think is going to save me if I jump off a mountain.
And I think you make a really good point there about styles and preferences. I mean, we don't want organizations that are entirely stacked with one type of people. I mean, fortunately, we are now in an environment where we increasingly both celebrate and encourage diversity and innovation and inclusion. But I think there's also a bit of a challenge there because, of course, culturally, we quite like people to fit in. And so I can see, for example, and you gave the example of Lloyd's, where they go, well, these guys don't fit in to our strategy, so we'll push them out. And I think the challenge has to be around having different perspectives and how you bring them together, how you get their input, be it through dialogue or other methods. Do you get involved in a lot of that? I imagine a lot of your work will be around mediation and addressing issues.
Not as much as you like, because I'm put in a box.
Mm-hmm.
Remember, my buyer has put me in a box. They see me as a regulatory consultant, and therefore I'm going to come along with a solution. Now, there's two. I call them jokes. Obviously, they're not going to be very funny to you, but there's two things that happen. People do not phone me up when everything is hunky dory. They haven't had a bad visit, and something's happened for them to want to talk to me in the most. I've got some very good clients that have just contacted me because they just want a different voice, and that's my client base. I like it. But generally, the phone will ring outside of that, and it's, Matt, we've got a problem, and I've got to go in, and I'm going in a very narrow swim lane, and that's my job.
Mm-hmm.
Now, the fact is, after a few minutes, I can see where the problems are, but the problems aren't in the swim lane I'm given. Mm. And that's one of the messages that it literally dawned on me at the Disrupt HR event as all the speakers were going through. And I actually changed my ending of that 5 minutes because of that realization that came to me was good HR managers are the solution, because it's about getting people to understand the context, or helping them understand the context outside of CBD ticking the box stuff. And I was going to, I can't remember how I was going to close up, but it was suddenly realized that there was 150 people in the room that really actually had the power to ensure that the business was going to move away from just doing as little as possible and earning much as possible. And what they can do is engage those people that work to understand why it's really important to do the right thing.
And do you think, because one of the challenges of HR now increasingly is that we have quite a diverse workforce. I mean, literally geographically, there'll be a decent percentage that are working from home. And of course, working from home just as easily means that you can be working in a different country or indeed continent.
Yeah.
And then when you have a very disparate workforce, sometimes loyalty and commitment can also be quite disparate. We don't necessarily sing the company song like we would have were we working in 1950. And that must itself provide lots of compliance challenges, because you potentially have different values, different expectations, different levels of loyalty, commitment, different definitions of what's acceptable.
I think you're absolutely right. The only analogy I can give to that is within my business, I would say probably 50% of my time is done is through training. Mm-hmm. I'd like to think my training is more mentoring. So I try and use my training more as a mentoring rather than by rote educational. I hate training by this method that we're talking now. I can't see your eyes. I can't gauge your reflections and your reactions. I can't see your eyebrows move in a way that you don't believe what I'm saying. Where if I've got you in the room, I'm sure the same must go for employees being in the room with other colleagues, where you get a sense of what's going on, because human interaction, since the dawn of time, I'm sure that's how we survived as a species. The very idea that we're now locked in our bedroom for most of the time working because it suits us and my boss lets me, I think we're losing a huge connection and a connectivity. And how do I ensure that that person now is following the path of the rest of us, the herd? I don't know.
Absolutely. And I'll expand on that a little. As you know, I'm shifted away from project and change management per se, still involved in that, but generally supporting and coaching. And one of the things that we found in coaching is that you lose that emotional connection There's less dopamine being transmitted when you're just over a video. And the other challenge is, and this sounds quite emotive, but people lie. And they lie with the best intents because, of course, what we're doing right now is presenting. And
Yeah,
when we're asked to present, we will always present the best version of ourselves.
yeah,
And of course, when we live in a world of social media and television and PowerPoint and Zoom, we're always trying to present good news or acceptable news or positive attitudes. And whereas lying may be possibly more too dramatic, the truth of the matter is, in these short video based exchanges, we seldom go into detail.
yeah, absolutely. And I'm sure there's adults listening to this, there's no children, so I'm going to swear now, but there's an expression that I learned in the army that I think reflects a lot, is bullshit baffles brains. And there is a survey I've seen, and I'm sure you would have read it with your science, is there was a study, and it's something I read many years ago when I first started training, was there was some research where they got some doctors in a room and they got an actor to present some medical science that was very complex, but the actor was a fantastic actor and presented this fantastic presentation. And then they asked for all the feedback from all these learned doctors that listened to this presentation, and they gave the speaker 10 out of 10 all around. Nobody had a problem with the presentation. Apart from, as you know where the bombshell is going here, the presentation was a complete fabrication of any truth. And that goes with the lie. So it's, nobody lies with intention, but what a lot of people are trying to do is impress.
Mm-hmm.
And, again, I'm a presenter. I need to stop people falling asleep in my AML. Will I tell a slight untruth in regard to a case study? Yes, I will. But the objective and the purpose of telling the untruth is to give a reflection on the outcome, which is we need to do the right thing. So sometimes I think the economics with the truth sometimes has a positive, if not a negative, outcome.
And I think, again, it's really interesting to expand on that. I mean, there are some quite dramatic landmark events about being economical with the truth. Perhaps the ones recognized in financial services would be sort of the big things like Enron. But I think currently playing out on TV every night is the post office scandal. And it's really interesting. I do recommend a Netflix documentary on how we treat whistleblowers.
Yeah,
I mean, that's really tough gig, isn't it?
it is. You're absolutely right. And Jersey fails miserably because we have no legislation that protects those people. The US have got a fantastic system, and it actually rewards you very handsomely if you're absolutely back on the money with your whistleblowing. So having a system that provides honest people with a route to go with a truth. The trouble with whistleblowing is a lot of people use whistleblowing for their grievances that have nothing to do with the truth. And that's difficulty with systems like that. But coming back to, I think the Americans have probably found more bad behavior through whistleblowing programs than any policy and procedure requirement that firms have to have that would just stop the bad behavior in the first place. Because at the end of the day, it's the human being that's seeing what's going on day to day is the person that we want.
That's a really interesting observation, and not one that I would have anticipated. The idea that actually it's the whistleblowers rather than the regulators and the investigators that are opening things up.
Well, I'm not going to. I get myself in enough trouble with the authorities as it is by saying how I see things, which I don't think is a bad thing, and we live in a free society. But I don't think regulators regulators do not find money laundering. What they find is people that aren't money laundering, that don't have systems and procedures to prevent and detect something they're not doing.
Mm-hmm.
I get your head around that.
Mm.
If regulators had these powers, the world would be a great place. But if you've only got 5 days, you are going to be ticking a box. You are going to be just going through this charade, this pantomime that gives somebody some sort of comfort that it's marvelous.
Mm-hmm.
And that goes back to a frustration of my 5 minutes. I think there is better ways that you can audit a firm. I used to say, I'm not an auditor by background. I became a regulator and did a visit because of meeting a regulator who visited me as an administrator. But one thing I found that you could always tell a good business within minutes, maybe an hour or so of being in that business, just by sitting there at a desk and listening to the people talking and the actions between employees and management.
Mm-hmm.
The one I always find is the open door policy. If anyone ever tells me to have an open door policy, I know that means there's a problem.
Mm-hmm.
Because actually anyone who walks through the door gets shouted at.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe the world's changed, I don't know. But I just find the reality, it's a sniff test. I think you can sense a good organization by just talking to the people.
Mm-hmm. I think you're right. I do think it's people that make a business, and it's a very old, possibly even hackneyed phrase that people are our greatest asset. But there are very few organizations that can actually survive without people. Although curiously, arguably, they're an increasing number as we now shift towards robotics, automation, and indeed AI. Increasingly, we have less and less people doing more and more work. And then, of course, we are reliant on the tools doing the regulation for us.
Well, I think as we speak today, I think there's a lot of conversation where a lot of this conversation is about the future. And I'm not quite sure where the future sits. But as we sit here today, AI is only as good as the information that it's got.
Mm-hmm.
AI, the process, is only as good as the garbage in, garbage out, which is an expression in the 80s. So that's not very AI-ish, I'm afraid, but it's true. There's got to be a coder that kind of gives it a clue of the process. There's lots of sophistication out there, but it's still gluing bits together. I used very quickly in the speech the Air Canada story, where somebody got some compensation from the chatbot of Air Canada's website because the chatbot went off and found the rules that it was supposed to talk about. It just so happens the rules were wrong. Mm-hmm. To the benefit of the client, thankfully. So at least the client benefited and Air Canada didn't. But that was because what it was using was wrong.
Mm-hmm.
And that's the problem where we sit today. There is efficiencies of AI in regards to those very administrative, repetitive jobs. I can see where that's going. But one, we need to make sure that checkbox, and go back to the point you made, that checkbox has to be designed by the airline pilot to enable us to fly the plane. If we get the coder in whatever country the coder is, and it could be in Jersey because there's lots of good coders or whatever, is going to design the checkbox, well, I think we're in trouble because what are they using to design the thing? Well, they're using a rule. So another thought comes to mind. I have lots of conversations in the past with these computer designers who develop software for banks, and my argument is they give the client what they think they need, not what they need. And the reason the computer people do it is because they go and read a law or a rule book and they build their system on that. The trouble is, and as one of my messages in my little 5 minutes, it's only 5 minutes, all these messages, is if a rule is written badly, you get a bad outcome. And if you look at lots of Jersey laws and rules, they're really badly drafted. So if you're going to rely on AI to give you a good outcome on something that is not going to give any intelligent being or computer, I think we're in trouble. So we've got to sort the rules out. We've got to clean everything up before we start relying on this AI stuff.
And I mean, that leads to another point. And perhaps, in defense of the regulator or exploring the challenge of regulation, when innovative and clever people or new technologies come up with novel ways of doing things, I mean, the regulator by definition is running behind, whether it's a few weeks behind or in some cases a few years behind. They're always playing catch up, aren't they?
Well, they are. I think by definition. However, I think there are ways that you can mitigate how that works.
Mm-hmm.
There's nothing forcing our regulator to be. And you mentioned in defence. I just want to say that there's no attacking of a regulator. I think I embrace regulation. I actually think we need regulators. But what I would like is proper, innovative regulators.
Mm-hmm.
Now, I think there's a kind of a mismatch in how we're behaving as an island. On the one hand, and I'm sure you're familiar with Moneyval, and where Jersey has a fear of being grey-listed, so we're going to do everything in our powers to be at the front of the peloton. You're a cyclist, you know that. You want to be at the front of the peloton. You're going to be there all the time. The trouble is, being at the front of the peloton from the beginning of the race to the end of the race is not going to actually happen. So that's something we need to learn from. But if you're trying to be at the front, but you've got a regulator that's behind, how is that actually working? Because we can't be both things. So some of the things we're doing it by rote because actually we just want to show somebody else that we're doing something. So one of my frustrations at the moment is we seem to have gone back in time. 90% of effort at the moment is on identification. And identification is very important, and particularly in this world of fraud. But for prevention and detection of money laundering, I don't think identification actually is the priority. It's source of funds and source of wealth, because money laundering is about criminal proceeds. Yet and this is globally, it's not just Jersey, everybody is focusing on the technology of passport recognition where someone lives. And I'm not dismissing it, so I need to be clear here. I think it's absolutely essential. I think electronic EID is brilliant and everyone should use it, and paper is a waste of time. But if I was a regulator, that's not what I would be spending my valuable time talking about, because there's other things that I would want the market to be looking at to stop money laundering, because having a biometric passport reader isn't going to stop money laundering. It's going to stop fraud, which is a predicate crime for money laundering, blah, blah, blah. But what we need to do is stop pandering or signposting that we're doing the right thing. And maybe we should step back and do what's right for us in regard to what we see is stopping the risk. And I think that takes a conversation, that takes a bit of bravery. But I think it means that we're not ticking a box.
There's a line in a song, I think it's the Rolling Stones, that says, every cop is a criminal. And it's making the point that actually, if you think like a cop, you possibly also, and if you want to be a good one, you possibly also have to think like a criminal, because otherwise, how are you going to catch them? How are you going to recognize? How are you going to identify? You must therefore, being at the top of your game in terms of compliance, actually be spending a lot of your time thinking how to get around compliance.
Well, you do know how to lose somebody on their first date, don't you? I don't think that's right. I know the point you're trying to make, but I've got to attack it from a couple of, or approach it from a couple of other ways. So, first of all, the policeman. So, one of the interesting dynamics of what you say is our poor regulator is losing lots of staff, and good staff, to the market, because there's lots of people that probably don't really know much about financial crime, but they know a lot about regulation. So they're there to embed put in the signposts, have these documents that would meet a regulatory standard. So
Mm-hmm.
what we're doing is re-perpetuating this tick box, give the regulator what they want. That's, whether or not you're a crook or a policeman, I don't know. And then it does lead to, well, you can then set the tempo of those documents in a way that the business can continue as it is, and that business possibly may not be doing what it should be doing, which is a kind of point I made, I think, right at the outset. So it may be an unconscious effect of my job, but it's certainly not a conscious one.
I just think, I mean, they often say when they arrest people, this person was brilliant. If they put the same amount of intellect into doing something that was legal, decent, and honest, they'll probably be even more wealthy than they are.
But is that not again, coming back to risk? If we allowed people to blossom and flourish and not give them some of the constraints, but again, I think this is where tick boxes, they constrain you in following a path, and that path is a path of least resistance, but it's not always right.
Mm-hmm.
And businesses will occasionally work out that they can't follow the rule, and they have exceptions, and that's good. So again, giving people the ability to make an exception and make another decision. But that turns into a compliance nightmare, because what you've got to do is prove to somebody in 3 years' time why you didn't get a passport and you took a portrait.
Mm-hmm.
You did do a right thing. The person wasn't a money launderer. You took a decision there and then, but somebody in 3 years' time is going to give you a good kicking because they can't see that you got the passport.
Mm-hmm.
So what do we all do? We enforce the rule absolutely all of the time, which then takes away the ability for that human to be flexible. So what I'm going to do is not be a compliance officer. I'll just be a crook because I have the flexibility to be good at my job.
Mm-hmm. That's a really interesting observation. A few years ago, I studied competition law in terms of European competition law for utilities and monopolies and stuff like that. And I had the great privilege of studying under a chap called Professor Richard Wish. And one of the great things about Richard was the stories. I mean, every case is a brilliant story. And I remember one in particular that I will share. Okay. He was talking about some Italian regulators who did a dawn raid, and they wanted to seize all the documents. But there were far too many documents that you were actually going to see in a day. So they say, we need to be directed to the third floor. So they all pile into the lift, and the lift gets stuck on floor 2.5 for several hours. Eventually, they make it to the third floor, and half the cabinets are missing. But they manage to make it to some of the cabinets and pull all the documents out, read as much as possible. But now it's the end of the day. So they use lead seals to seal the filing cabinets so they can't be fiddled with. Okay, so they put these lead seals on the cabinets, and then they withdraw for the evening to return the next day. They return the next day and they break the lead seals and find the cabinets empty. They pull them away from the wall and they realize the backs have been taken off the cabinets. This is a true story. And I'm really interested in how different jurisdictions and attitudes apply to regulators, because I can't say that the British would ever do that. Okay. But, different jurisdictions do have different risk appetites, different behaviors. Some regard things as purely guidance and suggestions. Some follow it rote.
Well, I think that's right. I think France don't have health and safety as a concept in law, in government, or anything. I don't. Just a Jeremy Clarkson thought that comes out there. I don't know if I can observe that, but I spend a lot of time in Mauritius.
Mm-hmm.
By some quirk of Comshaw's life. Comshaw's 19 years old, by the way, this month.
Wow, that's an amazing achievement.
Yeah, it makes me feel old. But I've been going to Mauritius, and the original purpose of me going to Mauritius was that Mauritius was starting its financial services life as an island, and it wanted to be Jersey, and wants to be Jersey. But there was a recognition that there was a lag. Jersey's been operating since the 70s, 80s, and it's developed its regulatory system in line with international standards and what have you, and it therefore is at the front of the peloton. My job really was, my business partner engaged me, was, Matt, we would like you to be the canary in the coal mine. We want you to come and tell us what's coming up. Tell us, not what we should be doing today, but tell us what we should be doing in 5-10 years' time. And one of my messages was always about that as a jurisdiction, and people from Mauritius who are watching this know that what I'm going to say now, but one of my messages is you're not a very compliant jurisdiction in rule and regulation. And back in the day, there was a bit of lying going on by everybody. So these standards that were being tested by Moneyval back in the day, everybody said they were compliant, and which is why FATF actually set up the assessment to actually come in lies, because everyone lied. Governments, regulators, all lied. But with Mauritius, anyway, so Mauritius, cutting a very long story short, got grey listed just as we were going into lockdown. So they had an unfortunate double jeopardy. They were grey listed, which meant they were losing business, and they were in lockdown COVID. So they did a lot of work to put things right. So they wrote lots of laws. They set up lots of other regulatory bodies. They put all these things in place, and they got their status back and as a well-regulated jurisdiction. So when I went back after lockdown for my first conference, we do a conference, I think everybody was hoping that I'd stand up and tell them everything was now marvellous and I didn't have to criticise. Obviously, I didn't, because I said to them, all you've done is created more laws that are badly written, and I don't think that any of your behaviours as individuals. So I think, coming back to, if I'm trying to answer your question, I think jurisdictions are under pressure to do things because, there's cost of living, there's just taxes and what have you, and they'll do anything they can to show that they're doing the right thing. And sometimes they're as bad as the firms having their tick boxes. And this is a self-perpetuating situation now. So, I'm quite sure I answered your question, but I think governments will do what they need to do to ensure that their economy survive. And some of those things possibly aren't the right things to do.
And I think it goes back to a point that you made very well earlier, this balance between collaboration and competition. I mean, when jurisdictions collaborate, perhaps around standards and processes and protocols, then we're all singing from the same hymn sheet. And whether or not in our lifetime or the next we'll see a world taxation process as opposed to a sort of parochial or country-based one is interesting. But in the meantime, you create an environment where people can literally shop around jurisdictions. And that must be a real challenge.
Well, it is. So, again, just using the money laundering theme. So, Financial Action Task Force has worked out that money launderers shop around for jurisdictions. So, if you remember Wolf of Wall Street, Leonardo DiCaprio jumps on a plane with his mother-in-law, which is the last thing he wants to do, but she's got all his criminal property in her bank accounts. But they go to Switzerland. Why? Because Switzerland didn't treat tax evasion or market manipulation as crimes in regard to the property. So everybody went to Switzerland with their criminal property. Now that's changed, and it's changed, one, because the Americans are very aggressive and throw people in jail, but also the international community, driven by FATF, has taken a view that if they can get everybody to at least hit 23 predicate offences that are equal, whether or not you're in Jersey, Nigeria, Australia, Timbuktu, that shopping around now stops. So a criminal, wherever they commit their crime, can't move their property and say, well, it doesn't matter because they're not going to treat that. So that world order it's happening, but it's happening very slowly. And it's painful, 230 odd countries, states and territories, to get them all aligning, and then having no loopholes within those types of laws is just impossible. So it really comes back to what type of country you want to be. Interestingly, in the UK, they've just published a manifesto to stop financial crime.
Mm-hmm.
Now, we all know that the UK and the Conservative government were very open to Russian money for 20 years. And Russian money for 20 years, as much as we all spoke around dinner tables knowing that it was proceeds of crime, we're all happy to accept it because the government were happy to accept it. Now, because of the war, that government view is flipped. So it now says that it was all bad and it should never happened, even though it's the same government. And now we've got this manifesto, and I posted it yesterday, or a link to it. And someone has already come back and said, well, maybe when the UK government stopped being so corrupt, maybe we'll start considering what they've got to say. And that was somebody from overseas that said it. So my only comment about that is there's too many countries that do as I say, not do as I do. And some of those countries that say that are the big, nasty countries that actually they want to stop the smaller jurisdictions succeeding, not because we're bad, it's just because we affect them in some way, which means that they can't do what they want to do, which is maybe not good. Cool, I go very good here.
And it may be on the fringe of your experience, expertise, and specialism. But, a few years ago, when we got all very excited about the blockchain, I mean, initially in terms of Bitcoin, because Bitcoin was a currency that could be universally moved all over the world without being encumbered by banks, etc. And then we recognized, well, actually, it's not just coinage that could be moved, it's contracts, it's legal documents. And if we all adopt a universal approach that cannot be fiddled with, that is constantly being audited, this would be wonderful. And it's never really materialized. There was a tremendous amount of promise, perhaps an awful lot of hype, but it hasn't delivered because blockchain is not new or novel now. It's at least 10 years old.
Yeah, absolutely right. And you're right. I had no knowledge specialism outside of the generality. So, and I think that's, but I think it's like anything. So, if you called your company whatever blockchain 10 years ago, you could sell it for billions of dollars because blockchain is the thing. It's AI now, isn't it? If I turn ComSure into ComSure AI, I'm sure I'd be worth something. But I think with blockchain, I think there is a value, and I think what we do is remember that blockchain isn't Bitcoin. It isn't a crypto asset. They're actually two things. They're different. I think blockchain. I think from what I've heard when I talk to people, that there is strong usage, but it's not the promise that we were given 10 years ago. So the very idea of having smart contracts that are held on this thing called a blockchain, which is a protocol. So, and there's more than one type of protocol. So whether it's called blockchain or whether, all these crypto assets run on a protocol or blockchain or similar, it actually will make our lives a lot easier. And I think actually there will be a time where I won't have to wait for Island Insurance to send my car insurance through the post and it gets opened. It'll literally be on my phone. There's this intelligent thing called a blockchain, which is the auditable, unbreakable relationship between me and the supplier. I think that exists. I think it's a development that will come about as a sort of almost a second wave. Now we've got rid of all the scammers who have made their money scamming the idea because they were selling blockchain on the back end of crypto. I think now the intelligent people that can actually see how we can improve it in business and in product and sales and purchases, I think blockchain will be there somewhere in the story, as I understand it. And I think blockchain in compliance will be there because having this auditable, unbreakable relationship between certain facts, I think, is good. I'm aware of certain products and services out there that I hear about, but I'm not using them and I haven't been introduced to any, but I'm definitely aware of they're being used and they're good.
And congratulations in Comsure being around 19 years. 19 years is a very mature, well-established and reputable business. As you look forward possibly to the next 19 years, depending on what your appetite is for another, how do you see both your business and the industry changing, given all these advents? In some cases, it does look like things are changing really quickly, but other elements of our conversation, things don't appear to have changed much at all. What's
No,
your prognosis for the future?
you're absolutely right. Well, I think until we get Terminator in and Arnie doing his thing, which is going to be more than 19 years away. So, ultimately we're dealing with humans.
Mhm.
Ultimately, we're dealing with inefficiencies in government, inefficiencies in the bodies that sit under government. And I don't want to be seen to be critical, so it's a critique, but our regulators could be better, and that's not just one particular regulator. All of them can be better. I think there may be a point where this financial action task force thing is going to sort of come to a point where it realizes that Einstein was onto something, that if we keep on doing the same thing, it's more insanity. Running around the world just telling people they don't have enough laws and they don't put enough people in jail, it's not attacking the problem. And I think there are more people now that are dawning on this and willing to shout out and just saying, stop the madness. Again, good intentions, FATF have good intentions. The UN have got good intentions to stop criminals benefiting from their crime. So again, I need to just make sure that nobody walks away and think Matt's going off on his an anarchist again. But I think, in answer to your question, I'd like to think that some sensibilities will come in and some intelligence will come in regard to addressing some of these things and taking the human out of the problem, albeit I don't think AI is going to solve it. I just want some open, intelligent, transparent discussions where people can speak freely. And in speaking freely, they're allowed to say something that the other person doesn't want to hear. Again, as you said, we can have a conversation, and I'm not going to say everything that you would agree with, but we're having an adult conversation, and vice versa.
And Matt, I've really valued this conversation because of that, because you've been very candid. You draw on real deep experience, not just in terms of being a specialist, but actually also having been in this industry, and of course with Comsure 19 years, but actually in the industry even longer than that. And I think that means you speak with authority and experience and knowledge with passion, and it's really clear you really do care. So thank you very much indeed for sharing your thoughts. And we will include a link to the Disrupt HR because that's definitely worth a watch. That was absolutely fantastic. Matt, thank you very much indeed.
I appreciate it, Tim. Thank you very much. And I'm going to be sending all my reference material to you to reference from now on. Thank you.
Thank you.
Cheers.